If you're someone who carefully reads ingredient labels, who avoids anything processed, and prides yourself on eating the cleanest diet possible, then what I'm about to share with you might sound completely backwards. Because there's a growing body of evidence out there suggesting that our obsession with food purity, fewer ingredients, fewer additives, fewer chemicals, inverted commas, might actually be making us less healthy, not more. And the reason has nothing to do with what you think you're avoiding, but everything to do with what you're accidentally removing. I'm Dr. Alex, and over the last decade working in emergency medicine, I've watched these health trends shift dramatically, from low fat to low carb to paleo to clean eating. And while I've seen some benefits from these movements, I've also noticed something really puzzling. People following incredibly clean diets often still struggle with things like inflammation, digestive issues, and immune problems that don't quite add up. So I started digging around a bit, digging into the evolutionary biology and the microbiology behind what we eat. And what I found completely changed how I think about food. Now, let me just acknowledge something up front here. If you've watched my other videos, then you'll know that I've consistently encouraged people to focus on single ingredient foods, to avoid ultra-processed foods, and to build meals from whole, recognizable ingredients. And I stand by that advice completely. It has enormous health benefits and forms the foundation of any healthy diet. But recently I've been diving deep into the research on fermented foods. I've been listening to the gut health experts and experimenting with adding more fermentation to my own diet. And what I've discovered has added an entirely new dimension to how I think about food preparation. Now, this isn't about contradicting what I said before. It's about adding a layer on top of that foundation that I think many of us, including myself until recently, have been missing. So this video is about that missing piece. And just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that whole foods are too simple or that you should go back to eating processed foods. The simplicity I'm talking about is biochemical. We've removed the beneficial microbial transformation step that traditional cultures used, not the wholeness of the ingredients themselves. Just a quick one before we carry on with the rest of the video. So I see messages and comments all the time from people who've watched a few videos but didn't realize they weren't actually subscribed. So could you do me a quick favor and just double check that you actually are? It takes just a couple of seconds and it really does help this channel to grow and keep moving in the right direction. If you are subscribed, then thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Anyway, let's carry on with the rest of the video. So this part is all about how we simplified food without ever realizing it. Now, to understand what's happening, we need to look at how dramatically food has changed in just the past century. The industrialization of food did something really strange. On one hand, it made food incredibly accessible and affordable. On the other hand, it dramatically simplified what we were actually eating. Modern processed food is built on a remarkably small foundation. Refined sugar, refined wheat flour, refined vegetable oils, and salt. Take a walk down the center aisles of any supermarket and you'll find that despite the thousands of products, they're nearly all variations on these same basic ingredients, just rearranged and flavored differently. Industrial processing takes whole foods and strips them down, removing the fiber, isolating sugars and starches, refining oils until they're chemically pure. Now, this kind of processing reduces complexity, and yes, it's generally harmful, but here's what almost nobody talks about. The clean eating movement, despite its good intentions, has sometimes pushed us towards a different kind of simplicity. When we focus exclusively on fresh, raw, unprocessed whole foods, eating everything as close to its natural state as possible, we've accidentally removed an entire layer of biological transformation that used to happen before digestion ever began. Traditional cultures didn't just eat whole foods, they prepared them in ways that fundamentally altered their chemistry. Things like grains were soaked overnight or fermented for days before being cooked. Dairy was cultured into yogurt or kefir. Vegetables were picked or fermented into krauts or kimchis. Soybeans were never eaten plain. They were transformed into things like miso or tempeh or natto through weeks or months of microbial fermentation. Even meat was often aged or slightly fermented before eating it. We've lost that step. Modern food culture skipped over this biological processing stage. And we didn't just lose some nutrients in the process, we lost an entire dimension of food chemistry that our immune system and gut microbiomes evolved to expect. Let me paint you a picture of what we've actually lost. So when you bite into an apple or a piece of kale or a serving of salmon, you're not just eating carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. You're consuming thousands of distinct chemical compounds. An apple alone contains over 10,000 different molecules. Polyphenols, flavonoids, organic acids, types of fiber, minerals, vitamins, and countless other compounds that we haven't even identified yet. Plants are chemical factories. They produce defensive compounds to protect themselves from insects and microbes. They create pigments to attract pollinators. They synthesize complex fibers and starches to store energy. And when we eat these plants, we're not just getting calories, we're getting a massive library of biological information that our bodies evolved to interpret and respond to. But for the vast majority of human history, these already complex foods weren't eaten fresh off the plant or the animal. They were transformed first. They were soaked in water for days. They were buried underground. They were dried in the sun. They were fermented in clay pots. They were aged in cool storage. And every one of these processes multiplied the chemical complexity even further, creating entirely new compounds that didn't exist in the original food. Before modern refrigeration, before we understood germ theory and became terrified of bacteria, food was regularly colonized by microbes before we consumed it. This wasn't contamination, it was transformation. Microbes would partially digest food, breaking down complex sugars, starches, proteins, and other compounds into smaller metabolites. These microbial processes created organic acids that preserve food and alter its pH. They produced bioactive peptides that have their own biological effects. They synthesized vitamins that weren't present in the original food, things like vitamin K2, various B vitamins, and others as well. They broke down anti-nutrients that would otherwise interfere with mineral absorption. They created entirely new flavor compounds, and most importantly, they dramatically multiplied the chemical diversity of what we eventually ate. Think of this as having a second digestive system that operated outside your body. Microbes did the first round of processing, transforming simple compounds into complex ones. And then your own digestive system handled the second round. This two-stage process meant that by the time food reached your gut, it was carrying an incredibly rich array of chemical signals. Signals that your immune system had learned to interpret over millions of years of evolution. And this is where things get a bit counterintuitive, because we need to distinguish between two completely different types of food processing. So when milk becomes yogurt or kefir, bacteria break down lactose into lactic acid. They create new proteins and peptides. They synthesize vitamins and produce dozens of other metabolites. The final product is biochemically far more complex than the starting material. When cabbage becomes sauerkraut or kimchi, lactobacillus bacteria ferment the sugars. They create organic acids that preserve the vegetables, break down plant cell walls, meaning nutrients are more accessible, and generate compounds that weren't present in fresh cabbage. When soybeans are fermented into miso or tempeh, then the transformation is even more dramatic. Proteins are partially digested, anti-nutritional compounds are neutralized, and entirely new flavor molecules and bioactive compounds appear. Grains fermented into sourdough bread, tea leaves fermented into kombucha. In every case, the fermented version contains hundreds or thousands of compounds that didn't exist in the raw ingredients. Microbial processing does the opposite of industrial processing. It takes relatively simple ingredients and multiplies their complexity exponentially. And here's why this matters so much more than people realize. Your intestines aren't just a tube that extracts calories. It's the largest immune organ in your body, containing roughly 70% of all your immune cells. And these immune cells aren't dormant, they're constantly active, constantly sampling everything that passes through, constantly making decisions about what's safe, what's dangerous, what requires a response, and what should be tolerated. Every single compound in your food sends signals to these immune cells. Some compounds trigger inflammatory responses. Others send anti-inflammatory signals. Some activate specific immune pathways. Others modulate how aggressive or tolerant your immune system becomes. Food isn't just fuel, it's information. It's a constant stream of chemical messages that your immune system interprets and responds to. And crucially, many of these new compounds created during fermentation have direct anti-inflammatory and immune modulating effects. The compounds created during fermentation don't just add flavour, they interact directly with your immune cells in your gut lining in ways that shift your entire immune balance. Short-chain fatty acids like butyrates, produced when bacteria ferment fibre, are powerful anti-inflammatory signals that calm overactive immune responses. Certain peptides created during protein fermentation can reduce gut permeability and strengthen the intestinal barrier. Organic acids produced during fermentation help to maintain the slightly acidic pH that beneficial gut bacteria prefer. These compounds work through multiple different mechanisms. Some bind to receptors on immune cells and directly modulate their activity. Others influence which genes get expressed in your gut cells, changing how they respond to potential threats. Others affect the balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory immune cells, tipping the scales towards tolerance and away from aggressive reactivity. And here's something really fascinating that challenges how most people think about probiotics. The microbes themselves don't even need to colonize your gut permanently to provide these benefits. Most bacteria in fermented foods pass through your system without setting up permanent residence, but their metabolites, the compounds they create, and even their cell fragments and DNA have biological effects. They train your immune system, they modulate inflammation and support gut barrier function, even if the bacteria themselves don't stick around. This is fundamentally different from how we usually think about gut health. It's not about establishing the perfect permanent microbiome. It's about regularly exposing your gut to diverse microbial inputs that keep your immune system properly calibrated. Your gut doesn't need precisely engineered doses of specific strains. It needs exposure to the complex, chaotic ecosystem that fermentation creates. It needs the chemical noise, the variety, the unpredictability that comes from food being transformed by microbial communities rather than by industrial processes. Now, most people seem to understand that eating inflammatory foods can cause problems. Processed junk food, trans fats, excessive sugar, these create inflammation. And inflammation drives chronic disease. What's less intuitive is that a lack of protective signals can be just as problematic as the presence of harmful ones. When your gut receives fewer distinct compounds, fewer microbial metabolites, fewer immune modulating signals, something subtle but significant happens. Your immune system becomes understimulated. It's not being challenged and trained in the same way it evolved to be. And an undertrained immune system doesn't become peaceful and calm. It often becomes reactive and hypersensitive instead, like a guard dog that hasn't been properly socialized. This manifests as a slow rise in baseline inflammation, not the acute inflammation that you get from an injury, but the chronic, low-grade inflammation that persists throughout your body. Your immune cells start reacting more aggressively to things that should be harmless. Your gut barrier becomes less stable. The regulatory signals that normally keep inflammation in check start weakening. And what happens is that you end up with inflammatory issues that have no obvious cause. Skin problems, joint pain, brain fog, autoimmune tendencies, even though you're eating what everyone would consider a healthy diet. This paradox is really painful, actually. You've cleaned up your diet, you've removed all the junk, you've focused on whole foods, and yet something still feels off. And the missing piece might not be what you're eating, but instead the biological complexity that you've inadvertently removed. The clean eating movement, for all its positive traits, carries an underlying fear of contamination. There's an assumption that complete sterility equals health, that any bacteria in food is dangerous. To be clear, avoiding industrial additives and chemicals is absolutely right. That kind of purity is protective. But we've overcorrected by also removing beneficial bacteria that humans have consumed for millennia. We've become terrified of all the bacteria in our food, seeing them as threats rather than partners. And so we pasteurize everything. We eat foods as fresh as possible. We avoid anything that's been sitting around or going a bit bad. But humans didn't evolve eating sterile food. We evolved eating food that was colonized by environmental microbes, often partially decomposed, frequently fermented, whether intentionally or accidentally. When we remove that exposure completely, we're depriving our immune systems of the very inputs they were designed to process. The fear of fermentation and aged foods means that clean eating often removes the very layer of biological transformation that makes food more compatible with human physiology. You end up with a diet that looks perfect on paper, whole foods, organic, minimally processed, but is actually biochemically simpler than what humans have eaten throughout evolution. Now, this obviously doesn't mean eating moldy food or letting things rot. It means deliberately including properly fermented, traditionally prepared foods that contain beneficial bacteria. So instead of asking, is this food clean, or how many ingredients does this have, or is this processed, maybe we should be asking, has this food been biologically transformed in a way that increases its chemical complexity? Fresh cabbage is good for us, but sauerkraut is much, much better, at least from the perspective of immune system training and anti-inflammatory signaling. Normal milk might cause some digestive issues in some people, but yogurt with live cultures is easy to digest and provides additional benefits that the fresh milk doesn't. Fresh soybeans are actually quite difficult to digest and contain compounds that interfere with nutrient absorption. Properly fermented tempeh or miso transforms those compounds into something beneficial. This doesn't mean that fresh whole foods are bad. Vegetables, fruit, unprocessed meats, these should absolutely form the foundation of your diet. And to be clear, fermented foods like sauerkraut or kimchi still align with the single ingredient principle that I've talked about before. They're made from whole, recognizable ingredients like cabbage, salt, and spices, just transformed through traditional fermentation rather than industrial processing. This is completely different from ultra-processed foods made in factories with additives that you can't pronounce. But adding a layer of traditional fermentation on top of that whole food foundation might be the missing piece for those people who are doing everything right, but are still dealing with inflammation or digestive issues. Obviously, you don't need to become a fermentation expert or start making everything from scratch. And you don't need to overhaul your entire diet. Begin really simple. Add one fermented or cultured food to your diet every day alongside what you're already eating. Start with really small portions. Your gut needs time to adjust if it's not used to these foods. And rotate through different types as well to maximize the diversity of the microbial inputs that you're receiving. Plain yogurt with live cultures is the easiest starting point for most people. Greek yogurt works really well, but choose the types that explicitly state they contain live active cultures, because many don't after processing. Kefir is even better if you can find it, as it typically contains far more bacterial diversity than yogurt. I know for a fact M&S in the UK sells it. For people who avoid dairy, there are coconut or even almond milk kefir options, though they're not quite as robust. Sauerkraut and kimchi are incredibly powerful, but they can be a bit overwhelming if you're not used to them. This is what I found when I first started eating it anyway. Start with a forkful alongside your regular meals. Make sure you're buying refrigerated versions that say raw or unpasteurized. Shelf-stable sauerkraut has been heat-treated, which kills all the microbes and defeats the entire point. Now, miso is surprisingly versatile. You can add it to things like soups, use it in salad dressings, or even just stir in a small amount to hot water for a simple probiotic drink. Tempeh is fermented soybeans pressed into like a cake, and it's excellent sliced and pan-fried. Kombucha has become really popular lately. And while some commercial versions are more sugar than substance, good quality kombucha can be a pleasant way to add fermented foods to your routine. Even sourdough bread, and yes, I know that generally I recommend minimizing bread and refined carbs, but if it's genuine slow fermented sourdough and not just regular bread with sourdough flavoring, it can provide some of these benefits when consumed in moderation. The long fermentation process breaks down gluten proteins, making the bread easy to digest and the minerals more bioavailable. But this isn't a license to eat bread with every meal, obviously. It's just acknowledging that if you're going to eat bread, then fermented sourdough is significantly better than the alternatives. The key to all of this is consistency and variety. Now, one daily serving from any of these categories will expose your gut to far more microbial diversity than most modern diets provide. You don't need to make your own necessarily, just buying quality fermented foods from the shop works perfectly fine. Modern chronic disease isn't only caused by what we added to food, things like the excess sugar, the refined oils, the artificial additives. It's also caused by what we removed. We removed microbes. We removed the transformation processes that created complex immune modulating compounds. We removed the chemical diversity that our gut ecosystems evolved to process. We made food simpler. We made it cleaner, more predictable, and more stable. All traits that sound positive but may have had unintended biological consequences. And the immune system noticed. It's responding to the absence of the signals that it expects, becoming dysregulated in subtle ways that manifest as inflammation, digestive dysfunction, and heightened reactivity to things that should be harmless. We can't supplement our way out of this. We can't take a pill that replicates the complexity of fermented foods. But we can reintroduce the traditional preparation methods that our ancestors used instinctively. Not because they understood microbiology, but because fermentation preserved food. It made it taste better and made them feel better when they ate it. The solution isn't abandoning clean eating entirely. Obviously, it's recognizing that health isn't built through purity and elimination alone. It's built through complexity, diversity, and regular exposure to the microbial world that we evolved alongside. Sometimes the healthiest version of a food isn't the freshest or the most pristine. It's the one that's been sitting in a jar for a few weeks, bubbling away, being transformed by the bacteria into something that looks less like clean but works better with your biology. I really hope that you got some value from this video. I know that this topic is a bit unusual. Thank you for staying this long, and I'll see you in the next one.